I probably should have realized the second I walked into that little cafe that Gary wasn't like the other guys I'd been seeing. He was sitting there in faded jeans and this threadbare old sweater, holding an actual newspaper like some retro throwback grandpa. I remember thinking he was either totally broke or one of those odd minimalist types. Either way, there was no denying he had that rugged, slightly weathered charm men get when they cross into their 40s. So I figured I could handle whatever his story was. When he asked me out, I made it clear right away that money didn't matter to me. I'm not the kind of woman who needs fancy restaurants or luxury gifts. I told him that on our second date, watching his shoulders drop like I just lifted some heavy burden off him. I've been married before, and I learned connection means far more than numbers in a bank account. It was exactly what he needed to hear. And truthfully, I believed it then. He came across sweet and grounded, pedaling his little bike everywhere and speaking of his small house like it was some sacred hideaway. I guessed he was probably a teacher or maybe working at a non-profit, something respectable but not lucrative. And that was fine with me. I could be the kind of girlfriend who cherished the simple life. Those first 3 weeks were honestly pretty close to perfect. Gary was thoughtful without being needy, funny without overdoing it, and he had this way of listening that made me feel like I was the most captivating person in the room. We'd take long walks through his neighborhood, which was nice enough if not remarkable. He'd point out quirky architectural details on the homes like he was giving me a private history tour. His own place was a tiny 2-bedroom that looked untouched since the 80s, but he kept it spotless. The yard was flawless. Everything neat and painted, just simple and plain. I even started calculating how much a renovation might cost, assuming we'd want upgrades once things turned serious. He drove this ancient Honda, easily 15 years old, but again, it was spotless and well kept. I admired that he wasn't fronting with luxuries he didn't have. There's something refreshing about a man who's secure enough not to overcompensate. I told my sister I'd finally met someone genuine, someone who valued moments over possessions. She wasn't convinced. My track record since my divorce hasn't been great, but I felt sure Gary was what I'd been looking for. The turning point came on some random Tuesday night when I was at his place making dinner. We were chatting about the weekend, and I suggested this new restaurant downtown everyone had been raving about. It's supposed to be amazing, I said, but kind of pricey. Maybe we could split or just share some starters. I thought I was being mindful of his budget, but he laughed and said money wasn't really an issue. That's when he casually dropped the revelation that changed everything. He owned his house outright, mortgage gone for years, even though he'd bought it as a teenager. His dad, Oliver, had helped set up the financing when he was only 17. Some kind of family investment plan I didn't fully follow. But bottom line, he'd been building equity for over 2 decades, while most people our age were just figuring life out. And he didn't work because he didn't have to. Smart investments, he said, as if it was ordinary early retirement through planning and discipline. I stood there, stirring sauce, trying to absorb it while keeping my face neutral. But inside I was reworking every assumption I'd ever made about this man. The small house wasn't a constraint. It was a preference. The old car wasn't about necessity. It was a statement. The bike rides and modest life weren't survival tactics. They were habits of someone with enough money not to prove a thing. Suddenly, our relationship looked completely different. and I couldn't tell if I was impressed or irritated that he'd been letting me think otherwise. Here I was, planning budget-friendly dates, and being the considerate one while he could have taken me anywhere. The discovery was both thrilling and infuriating. Thrilling because it opened doors I hadn't imagined, infuriating because he let me operate under false beliefs. From then on, I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. We could travel, really travel, not just weekend getaways, but actual trips abroad, the kinds I'd dreamed about forever. We could go to fine restaurants without me worrying about bills. I even started researching European couples trips, those luxury cruises that had always felt out of reach, picturing what it would be like to finally have a partner who could deliver. That I began floating ideas into casual conversation, testing him. Wouldn't a wine tour in Tuscany be amazing? Or seeing the northern lights in Iceland? He'd nod politely, agree they sounded great, but never once suggested making plans. It was like he was determined to cling to this modest persona, even though I knew better now. The more I thought about it, the more unanswered questions piled up. If he'd retired early, just how much money were we talking? Was this comfortable living or serious wealth, the kind that could reshape our future entirely? I deserved to know if we were building a life together. So I started asking, not bluntly, just light questions about his investment style or how he'd cleared his mortgage so young. But Gary would always deflect, offering vague, unhelpful replies. That kept me no closer to the truth. It was starting to feel like he was dodging me on purpose, which made no sense considering we'd been together for over a month by then. Things were clearly heading toward something serious. So why the cloak and dagger act about his money? The first time I asked outright, we were at dinner at that pricey restaurant I'd originally mentioned. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd brought me there anyway, and when the check arrived he slid over his card without even glancing at the total. So, I said, keeping my tone light and playful, what's your actual financial situation? How much do you have invested? It felt like a fair question between two grown adults developing feelings for one another. But Gary's face tightened, and he launched into a speech about relationship phases and appropriate timing for disclosures. I don't think we're at a point yet where we should be asking questions like that, he said, as if I'd asked for his private medical records instead of the basics of his finances. I smiled and pretended to accept it, but his reaction left me rattled. We weren't kids fumbling through first love, we were divorced adults in our late 30s. What's more appropriate than being honest about the realities of building a future together? I let it go for the moment, but the questions kept circling in my mind. He'd mentioned smart investments, but what did that actually mean? Stocks, properties, some family trust one didn't know about? And when he claimed he could afford not to work, was that just enough for one person, or enough to sustain a family in comfort? These weren't shallow questions. They were real concerns for someone who was starting to imagine a life with him. Yet whenever I tried again, he'd trot out that same line about timing and boundaries. It began to feel like a rigged game. He knew everything about me, my job, the financial fallout from my divorce, my retirement anxieties, because I'd been transparent from the start. Meanwhile, his wealth was treated like top secret intel I wasn't cleared to access until we hit some undefined milestone he'd never bothered to explain. I tried every tactic I could think of. Sometimes I slipped financial questions into bigger conversations about dreams and goals. Other times I was direct, telling him I wanted to understand his priorities. Once I even admitted that his secrecy made me feel shut out of a major part of his life. But no matter the approach, his answer never changed. Too soon, not the right stage, we need to go slower. It was maddening, especially when I'd see how freely he spent. He'd casually drop $2,000 on some investment play or show up with an overpriced bottle of wine, but God forbid I ask how much he actually had in reserve. The contradiction made me crazy. By week 6, my patience was gone. One night over dinner at his place, the topic of retirement came up. I mentioned my worries about saving enough after my divorce and suggested maybe we should start thinking about our financial compatibility long term. I thought I was being mature, but instead of engaging, Gary snapped into his usual routine about privacy and boundaries. The talk escalated. I raised my voice, not screaming, but sharper than usual, because I was fed up with being treated like a stranger while trying to discuss our future. To me, it was a normal conversation. To him, I sounded like some opportunist clawing at his fortune. I backpedaled quickly, trying to smooth things over, but the damage was done. He shut down for the rest of the night, and I could feel him pulling away like one moment of frustration had undone everything between us. It felt wildly unfair. I'd been patient for weeks while he played his mystery millionaire role, but the instant I pushed back, I was painted as the problem. The truth was, I really liked him. When I met his friends, Lauren, Christy, and Barry, the following week, I finally understood why he valued their opinions. They were funny, warm, and obviously loyal to him. I enjoyed their company, and I think they liked me too, which felt important after all the tension. For a few hours, it almost felt normal, like maybe I could forget the secrecy and just enjoy belonging in his circle. But even then, the thought nagged at me. These people had known him for years. Surely they knew the truth about his wealth. Were they all in on the secret? Did they think it was acceptable for him to keep me in the dark while calling this a real relationship? I didn't dare ask them. That would have been crossing a line and probably would have gotten back to Gary. So I focused on being warm and likable, fitting myself into his world as smoothly as possible. Laughed at Barry's bad jokes, praised Christy's cooking, and asked Lauren thoughtful questions about her career. But the time we left, I felt sure I'd made a good impression, which seemed crucial if Gary and I were going to last. At least if things got serious, I knew I wouldn't face resistance from his friends. But the secrecy kept gnawing at me. But the 2-month mark, I couldn't believe we still hadn't broken through that wall. It felt like long enough to establish trust and honesty about the basics. Wasn't asking to merge finances or plan retirement accounts together. I just wanted the truth. All I wanted was to understand the broad outlines of his situation. Was that so unreasonable? I decided to give it one last try. The following weekend, we were lounging at his place on a quiet Saturday, chatting about random things. I eased into the subject as carefully as I could, telling him I cared about him and wanted to know every part of his life, including his approach to money and long-term planning. I thought I was being thoughtful and mature, framing it as genuine curiosity, not greed or intrusion. But Gary's reaction was swift and final. He said he felt his privacy was being violated, that we hadn't hit a milestone that justified the kind of disclosure I was looking for. He explained how money had wrecked past friendships and strained family ties, how people's attitudes toward him changed the moment they learned about his wealth, and how he'd learned to be guarded. Then, just like that, he told me he thought we should end things. 8 weeks gone in an instant, because I'd asked what I thought were fair questions about his finances. I tried to explain, maybe too emotionally, that I wasn't prying, that I just wanted to understand him better and think about a possible future together. But he was calm and firm. He said we clearly had different expectations about boundaries and timing, and that it was better to walk away before we got in deeper, as if my 2 months of effort didn't already count as emotional investment, as if his comfort with secrecy mattered more than my need for basic honesty. I left his house that afternoon in shock. What was supposed to be a lazy weekend hangout had turned into the abrupt end of the most promising relationship I'd had since my divorce. And for what? 'Cause I asked my boyfriend to be transparent about his finances, because I wanted to know the practical side of building a life with him. It all felt surreal and painfully unfair. The hardest part is that I still think I was right. We're not 20-year-olds playing at romance. We're adults with responsibilities, futures to plan, and a need for trust. If he was serious about me, financial compatibility should have been part of the conversation. The fact that he got so defensive makes me wonder if he was ever as committed as I thought. I keep replaying it, asking myself if I should have waited longer. Should I have let him bring it up in his own time? But how long was I supposed to wait? 6 months? Year? At what point does patience stop being reasonable and start enabling avoidance? I truly believe I was fair in what I asked, but apparently it was too much for someone who equates privacy with control. The irony is that even his friends seemed to think he overreacted. Word got back to me that Lauren, Christy, and Barry weren't all on board with his decision. Some of them felt he was being childish and far too guarded, which reassures me that I wasn't out of line. Even the people who know him best can see that his boundaries around money are extreme and sabotaging his relationships. But Gary doesn't take advice well. He's so sure his way is the right way that he can't see how his secrecy reads as mistrust, or even selfishness. I was willing to be patient. I was willing to respect his cautious nature. But I wasn't willing to be kept permanently in the dark about something so foundational. Now, I'm back to dating apps, sitting through awkward first dates, trying to find someone who understands that a real partnership requires honesty, even about money. My retirement planning is back to relying on my own modest savings and whatever else I can scrape together in the next couple of decades. The future I started picturing with Gary has vanished because he couldn't handle straightforward questions about his wealth. Some people might say I should have been more patient, that 2 months isn't long enough to expect transparency. But I don't agree. I wasn't asking for bank passwords or merged assets. I was asking for general information that directly affects long-term choices. If he couldn't share even that after 2 months, what does it say about his ability to trust or commit? I think Gary will keep struggling in relationships until he learns to balance his need for privacy with the reasonable expectations of the women he dates. You can't hold someone at arm's length forever and expect them to keep waiting. At some point, secrecy just looks like selfishness, and patience just looks like settling. So here I am again, single at 39, trying to find someone who can talk about money and the future without getting defensive. Maybe one day Gary will realize he pushed me away unnecessarily. Maybe his friends will convince him he was too rigid. But I doubt it. A man who ends a relationship over basic financial questions probably isn't ready for the kind of partnership I'm looking for anyway.